Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a really fascinating part of Indian history, tribal revolts against colonial rule. And this is one you really don't want to miss if you're prepping for the UPSC exams, especially the GS1 Modern Indian History paper. But even if exams aren't on your radar, stick with us. This is a story everyone should know. Before we jump in though, quick favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and smash that bell icon so you don't miss any of our future deep dives.
All right, let's get to it. We've got a ton of material to cover. Major tribal revolts across different regions and time periods. Its story of resistance, resilience, and how these revolts actually shaped India's path to independence. But to really get this, we got to set the stage first. Our sources paint this picture of pre-colonial tribal communities, largely self-governing, with unique social structures and a deep connection to their land and forests.
What's really fascinating is they weren't just living in the forests, they were living with the forests. Their lives, livelihoods, their entire cultural and spiritual identity all intertwined with nature, and that's where the clash with the British began.
So the British show up, and boom, everything changes.
You could say that. The British saw forests as resources to be exploited. Timber, minerals, land for cultivation, this totally different view of nature. To control it, profit from it, it clashed completely with how tribal communities saw their environment.
So it wasn't just about taking control, it was forcing a whole different worldview on them.
Exactly. That disconnect, that clash, fueled decades of conflict and resistance. Imagine if your home, livelihood, your whole cultural identity were suddenly threatened. Wouldn't you resist?
Totally. It's like someone coming into your home and rearranging all your furniture. You'd push back a bit, right?
Yeah.
Our sources highlight a bunch of factors that triggered these uprisings. What were the big pressure points that pushed these communities over the edge?
Well, picture this. Your ancestral lands, the forests you depend on, suddenly declared government property. That's what happened with policies like the Permanent Settlement, and later the Forest Acts. These policies stripped away their land rights and opened the door for exploitation by landlords and merchants.
So a direct attack on their economic and cultural foundations.
Exactly. And on top of that, the British brought in these new revenue systems, often imposing heavy taxes, eroding their economic stability even more.
So losing their land and getting squeezed financially.
Exactly. And let's not forget the intermediaries. The British relied on local merchants and moneylenders to collect taxes and enforce their policies. These outsiders saw an opportunity to exploit the tribal communities, driving them further into debt and poverty.
It's like a system designed to extract wealth from them.
That's a sharp observation. And remember, it wasn't just about economics. The British also went after their cultures and traditions, sometimes directly, sometimes through Christian missionaries.
Trying to erase their entire way of life?
You could say that. They saw tribal customs and beliefs as backward and uncivilized, and they wanted to replace them with their own ideas of modernity and progress.
And that cultural clash, combined with the economic hardship and loss of land, created a powder keg. It's no wonder they revolted.
Yeah.
Now, our sources categorize these revolts into 3 distinct phases, each with its own characteristics and leadership styles.
Think of it as a timeline of resistance, each phase reflecting how British rule evolved and the growing awareness within tribal communities. The first phase, from 1795 to 1860, it was marked by revolts led by traditional tribal leaders, chiefs, headmen, those whose authority was directly undermined by British policies. They were fighting to protect their communities from this new wave of colonialism.
The first wave of resistance, led by those whose traditional power was disrupted. What about the second phase?
As British control got stronger and their economic policies became more extractive, we see a shift. The second phase, from 1860 to 1920. The leadership often came from the most marginalized within tribal societies. These were the people hit hardest by British policies, dispossessed of their land, forced into labor, struggling to survive.
Sounds like the pressure cooker is about to blow. Stakes are higher, the anger more intense.
Exactly. And then we hit the third phase, from 1920 to 1947. This period is crucial. We see tribal movements intertwining with the Indian nationalist movement.
So now the fight for tribal rights is merging with the fight for India's independence.
Precisely. Tribal leaders started to see the British as a common enemy. They connected their struggles with the larger movement for Swaraj.
Swaraj, the idea of self-rule. That was a powerful force at the time.
It was, and for tribal communities, it resonated deeply. It wasn't just political independence. It was about reclaiming control over their lives, their land, their destiny.
It's fascinating how these revolts evolved over time, reflecting the changing political landscape and the growing awareness within tribal communities. To really understand them, though, we need to look at some specific examples. Where do we start?
Let's go back to 1778. to the Paharia Rebellion, led by Raja Jagannath. This one highlights the early resistance to British expansion into tribal territories.
The Paharias, living in the hills of what's now Jharkhand and West Bengal, known for being fiercely independent. What sparked the rebellion?
The Paharias were skilled hunters and cultivators. Their livelihood depended on the forests. When the British started encroaching on their territories, trying to expand agriculture and extract resources, the Paharias saw it as a direct threat to their way of life.
So the British tried to impose their economic model on a system that worked perfectly well for centuries.
Exactly. The Paharias resisted fiercely, first with open warfare, then later through guerrilla tactics, making it really tough for the British to establish control.
Masters of guerrilla warfare, using their knowledge of the land to their advantage. Did the British ever manage to quell the rebellion?
They tried, through force and by trying to win over Paharia leaders, but the Paharias were a constant thorn in their side. They showed that these tribal communities weren't going to just give up their land and freedom without a fight.
Powerful message. Okay, where to next on our historical road trip?
Let's head to the region between Chotanagpur and the plains of Bengal, where the Chuar uprising took place. This rebellion, which raged from 1767 to 1802, shows us just how brilliant tribal warfare could be.
This one was led by the legendary Durzan Singh, right? What was the main issue that sparked this uprising?
Again, it comes down to British expansion and encroachment on tribal lands. As the East India Company expanded its influence, they started interfering with the Chuars' way of life, their access to forests, trade routes, their systems of governance. The Chuars, known for their fighting skills and knowledge of the terrain, they weren't going to just sit back and watch.
So they took up arms.
Yeah, they did. And they used guerrilla tactics that were incredibly effective. Surprise attacks, harassing supply lines, and then melting back into the forests, making it nearly impossible for the British to find them.
Using the jungle as their weapon?
Yeah.
How long did they manage to hold out?
The Chuar uprising lasted for decades, a real testament to their determination and resilience. It showed the British that controlling these tribal territories wouldn't be easy.
Amazing how these communities,
Yeah.
with limited resources, could hold off a power like the British for so long. What other rebellions should we highlight from this early period of resistance?
Let's not forget the Tamar Revolts, which occurred between 1789 and 1832 in the Chotanagpur region. This uprising, led by Bola Nath Sahay, it was a response to the British revenue system, particularly a system called the alignment system.
This alignment system. It sounds like another one of those policies designed to extract revenue from these communities.
It was. It led to widespread land alienation and economic hardship for the Orans. The main tribal group in the Tamar area, they felt the British were unjustly taking their land and disrupting their traditional agricultural practices.
So messing with their land meant messing with everything.
Exactly. The Tamar Revolts show how fiercely they were willing to fight to protect their land and their way of life. This uprising got support from other tribal groups too, who shared similar grievances. It turned into a regional rebellion against British rule.
A true testament to their spirit of resistance. What happened in the end? Were they successful?
The Tamar Revolts, like many of these early uprisings, were eventually suppressed, but they left a mark. They forced the British to acknowledge the deep resentment towards their policies and the need to be more careful when dealing with tribal communities.
It's a reminder that even in defeat, these rebellions had a huge impact on the trajectory of British rule in India. Okay, where to next?
Let's go to the Khandesh Hill Ranges, where the Pin Hills waged a series of uprisings against British rule. Throughout the 19th century,
The Bills, known for their archery skills and guerrilla tactics. What drove them to rebel?
the Pils had traditionally enjoyed a lot of autonomy under previous rulers. When the British occupied Khandesh in 1818, they imposed their own systems of administration, disrupting the Bills' traditional way of life. They resented losing their forest and land rights, the restrictions on their movements, and the attempts to control their traditional practices.
Classic clash of cultures.
Yeah.
And resistance to imposed authority.
Exactly. And the Bills, true to their warrior culture, didn't just protest, they launched a series of revolts, each one highlighting their determination to resist British rule.
And how did these revolts play out? Were they able to achieve any lasting victories?
While they never fully overthrew British control, their constant uprisings forced the British to make concessions. Their resistance helped shape British policies towards tribal communities, pushing them towards a more conciliatory approach in some cases.
It's a reminder that even facing overwhelming odds, consistent resistance can chip away at the power structures. Okay, what other rebellions should we explore from this period?
Let's head south to the Western Ghats, where we have the Ramosi uprising of the 1820s. The Ramosis, a community spread across Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh, had traditionally served in the Maratha army. When the British took over, they lost their livelihood and faced increasing marginalization.
So another community displaced by the shift in power.
Precisely. And this displacement, along with resentment towards British policies and the loss of their patrons, led to the Ramosi uprising in 1822. They launched attacks, plundered the town of Satara, sent a clear message to the British that they weren't going down without a fight.
Making a statement. But how did the British respond to this challenge?
At first, they tried to crush the rebellion with force, but they quickly realized that the Ramoses' knowledge of the terrain and their guerrilla tactics made them hard to defeat, so they switched tactics, offering the Ramoses land grants and positions in the new hill police.
So if you can't beat them, join them.
You could say that. It was a pragmatic move. It pacified a potential threat and gave them a valuable asset, a local force who knew the terrain and could maintain order.
Interesting how these revolts forced the British to adapt. Sometimes brute force, sometimes subtle co-option. What other examples do we have of this dynamic?
Let's journey to the northeast, to Assam, where the Ahom revolt erupted in 1828. The Ahoms, once rulers of a powerful kingdom, were forced to sign a treaty with the British after the First Anglo-Burmese War. But the British, seeing Assam's strategic importance, decided to stay, breaking their promise to withdraw.
So a betrayal of trust.
Exactly. And this betrayal, plus the resentment towards British policies that undermined Ahom authority and traditions, led to the Ahom revolt.
So classic colonial double-dealing sparking resistance.
Precisely. The Ahoms, led by Gomadar Kanwar, fought fiercely, using their knowledge of the land and their warrior traditions. But like many of these early revolts, they were eventually crushed by the superior firepower and resources of the British.
Another tragic defeat, but one that highlights the Ahoms' determination to defend their homeland and way of life.
Absolutely. Now, let's travel back to the Chotanagpur region, a hotbed of tribal resistance, where we find the Kol Uprising of 1831. The Kols, like many other tribal groups, were deeply affected by British policies. That eroded their traditional systems of governance and opened the door for exploitation by outsiders.
So the British were dismantling the very foundations of Kol society.
You could say that. They introduced new laws that undermined the Kol chiefs, encouraged outsiders to settle in Kol territories, and brought in merchants and moneylenders who exploited the Kols, driving them into debt and disrupting their traditional economic system.
Familiar pattern of colonial disruption and exploitation.
It is. And the Kols, known for their fierce independence, rose up in revolt. The Kol Uprising was widespread and violent, targeting British officials, outsiders, symbols of colonial authority.
Striking at the heart of the system that oppressed them. How did the British respond?
They sent in troops and launched a brutal campaign of suppression. The rebellion raged for over a year before it was finally crushed. It was a costly victory for the British, highlighting the intensity of tribal resistance and the challenges they faced in consolidating their rule over these regions.
Every rebellion, even in defeat, chips away at that image of colonial invincibility.
That's a great point. Now, how about we venture to the picturesque Khasi Hills in the northeast, where we have the Khasi Uprising of 1829-33. This one's different because it was triggered by a specific infrastructure project.
Okay, this sounds interesting. What was this project, and why did it cause such strong resistance?
The British wanted to build a road, connecting the Brahmaputra Valley with Sylhet, running right through the Khasi Hills. Seems harmless, right? But for the Khasis, it was about sovereignty and control over their land. The British, without talking to the Khasi chiefs or getting their permission, started building the road, encroaching on Khasi territories, disrupting their traditional way of life.
So again, the British imposing their will without any regard for local communities.
Exactly. And to make things worse, they started forcing Khasi laborers to work on the road, which was seen as a direct attack on their freedom and dignity.
Almost like they were intentionally provoking the Khasis.
It seems that way. And the Khasis, under the leadership of Utiro Singh, a charismatic Khasi chief, rose up in rebellion. They used their knowledge of the hills and forests to their advantage, launching a guerrilla war against the British.
Using the terrain as their weapon, just like the Chors and the Paharias.
Exactly. The Khasi uprising raged for several years, costing the British a lot in resources and manpower. It showed them that controlling these hill territories would be much harder than they thought.
A testament to the Khasis' determination and their willingness to defend their land and their way of life, even against a powerful enemy. Okay, what other stories of resistance should we explore?
Let's talk about one of the most significant tribal revolts, the Santhal Rebellion of 1855.
I've heard about that one, but I'd love to dig a little deeper. What led to it?
It's complicated, but like a lot of the revolts we've talked about, it was about land, exploitation, the systematic destruction of their way of life.
And British disrupting the balance again.
Exactly. The Santhals, a proud and independent community, lived for centuries in harmony with their environment. They had their own agriculture, governance. But then the British arrived. They brought their land revenue systems, and things changed drastically for the Santhals.
Those land revenue systems, always trouble.
Right. The British, they wanted to get as much revenue as possible, so they implemented the permanent settlement system, aiming to create a stable revenue base for themselves. But it ended up taking land away from the Santhals.
How so? Seems like a system for stability would do the opposite.
It's ironic, isn't it? The permanent settlement recognized zamindars as the legal owners of the land, gave them hereditary rights over huge estates. A lot of these zamindars were outsiders, moneylenders, merchants, speculators. They saw the Santhals and their land as a way to get rich.
So the Santhals were at the mercy of these new landlords.
Exactly. They had to pay crazy taxes, often losing their land if they couldn't pay. And to make things worse, the British legal system didn't protect the Santhals. They became more and more marginalized and powerless.
A system designed to fail them.
You could say that. It was just a matter of time before things blew up, and they did.
So tell me about the Santhal Rebellion.
In 1855, two Santhal leaders, Sidhu and Kanhu, they emerged from the people who had lost everything. They saw the injustice and turned it into a powerful movement.
Those names should be more well known.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Sidhu and Kanhu declared a rebellion against British rule. They called for a free Santhal state.
So they were fighting for their land, but also for their sovereignty.
Exactly. They wanted their people to break free from oppression, reclaim their land, restore their way of life. Their message resonated with the Santhals. They had suffered for decades.
And the response?
It was huge. Thousands of Santhals joined the fight. They used their traditional weapons, bows and arrows, axes, swords, and attacked everything that represented British authority and the Zamindars' power.
Fighting back against their oppressors.
Exactly. They attacked police stations, burned down houses of Zamindars and moneylenders, destroyed government records, disrupted communication and trade routes, bringing the whole region to a standstill.
This sounds like a serious threat to the British.
One of the most significant uprisings in Indian history. It made the British see what their policies had done. They saw the anger they had created.
So what happened? Did the Santhals succeed?
Like many of these revolts, it was eventually put down. But even in defeat, it had a lasting impact. The British realized their policies had backfired, so they created a separate administrative region called the Santhal Parganas.
Trying to appease them.
You could say that. The Santhal Parganas was an attempt to give the Santhals some autonomy and acknowledge their land rights. They also reformed the land revenue system, tried to reduce the exploitation by the zamindars.
It's like the British were always reacting instead of preventing these situations.
That's a good observation. The Santhal Rebellion is a perfect example. Even though they tried to fix things, the damage was done. The seeds of discontent had already been sown.
So even in defeat, these rebellions pushed the British to change their approach.
Absolutely. Now let's move to the mountains of Odisha, to the Khand uprising between 1837 and 1856.
The Khans, another group with a rich history and culture. What were their issues with British rule?
The Khand uprising is fascinating. It shows the clash between British culture and indigenous practices. The Khans practiced something called Mariah sacrifice, involving human sacrifice as an offering to their gods.
That sounds intense.
It was a deep part of their religious beliefs and culture. But the British, they saw it as barbaric and inhumane, and decided to stop it.
So again, the British forcing their values on a culture they didn't understand.
Precisely. The Khans saw this as an attack on their religious freedom and a violation of their traditions.
I bet they weren't happy about that.
They weren't. This resentment, plus other things like new taxes and the growing influence of zamindars and moneylenders, led to the Khand uprising.
So it was a bunch of things. But suppressing their religious practices seems like the final straw.
It was a major factor, definitely. In 1837, a leader named Chakra Bissoy emerged. He rallied his people against British rule. They used guerrilla tactics and open warfare, attacking British outposts, harassing officials, disrupting trade.
Putting up a good fight.
They were. They even got support from other tribal groups in the area, like the Savaras, showing the growing solidarity among those resisting the British.
Strength in numbers. What happened in the end?
Sadly, Chakra Bissoy disappeared in 1855. Another leader, Radha Krishna Dandasena, was captured and hanged in 1857. With their leaders gone, the movement faded, and the British took control again.
Another sad example of colonial suppression.
It is. But the Khand uprising, like all these revolts, reminds us of the human cost of colonialism, the clash of cultures, and the enduring spirit of resistance.
Important to remember these stories and the sacrifices these communities made.
Absolutely. Now let's go to the Western Deccan, the region around Ahmednagar in Maharashtra, where the Koli uprising took place in the 1820s.
The Colis.
Yeah.
Seems like every tribal community in India fought back against the British.
You're right. The Colis, they were integrated into the Maratha power structure, but when the British arrived, they became more and more marginalized. They lost their traditional roles, they faced economic hardship because of new land revenue systems, and they resented the exploitation by moneylenders and merchants.
Same old story. Losing their land, getting exploited, being pushed aside.
Exactly. And this led to the Koli uprising, led by Ramji Bangre. He was a former Jamadar in the British-controlled Nayakwari police.
Wait, so he turned against the system he was part of?
He did. He saw the injustices people were facing, and he decided to fight back. He rallied the Colis, they attacked moneylenders, destroyed their records, disrupted British administration.
That's a powerful statement. Quitting your job to fight for your people.
It is. Shows how unhappy they were, and how committed they were to regaining their dignity and autonomy. The British eventually crushed the Koli uprising, but it showed them the resentment that was bubbling under the surface.
Another example of how these revolts forced the British to face reality.
Now let's go back to Chetnogpur, a place of strong tribal resistance, to the Birsa Munda revolt of the 1890s.
Birsa Munda. Anyone who's studied Indian history knows that name.
He's a true icon, a symbol of tribal resistance. Birsa Munda was from the Munda tribe, a community hit hard by British policies, especially those about land and forests.
So those familiar themes are back.
They are, but Birsa Munda's movement was about more than just that. He tapped into something deeper, their cultural and spiritual identity. He wanted his people to reclaim their traditions and resist the British values being forced on them.
He sounds like a visionary.
He was. He encouraged his followers to reject things like alcohol, to cleanse their villages and bring back their old beliefs and practices. He preached self-reliance, unity, resistance. He wanted the Mundas to stand up for their culture and freedom.
A desire to protect their identity against colonial pressure.
Exactly. And it was a powerful message. His movement grew. They targeted anyone they saw as oppressors. British officials, landlords, moneylenders, even Christian missionaries.
Challenging the whole system.
He was. They attacked government buildings, police stations, houses of landlords and moneylenders. They disrupted missionaries and encouraged the Mundas to go back to their traditional faith.
A full-scale rebellion.
It was a big challenge to British authority. The British responded with force, as usual. They sent in troops, and Birsa Munda was captured in 1900.
Another tragic end to a powerful movement.
Sadly, yes. Birsa Munda died in prison a few months later. But his legacy lived on.
How so?
Even though it was suppressed. His movement had a huge impact on the tribal communities. In Chhattisgarh and beyond, it made people aware of their grievances. It inspired future generations to fight for their rights. And it forced the British to pay attention to the needs of tribal populations.
Even in defeat, he planted seeds for change.
Exactly. Birsa Munda's legacy is still celebrated in India. His birth anniversary, November 15th, is now Janjatiya Gaurav Divas, a day to honor the contributions and sacrifices of tribal communities.
That's fitting. Now I'm wondering, were all the revolts violent?
Not at all. There were lots of ways to resist British rule. Some communities chose nonviolence and cultural assertion, like the Tana Pagat movement, among the Oranon tribes of Chhattisgarh in the early 20th century.
The Tana Bagats. I've heard the name, but tell me more.
They're a fascinating example of how tribal communities responded to British colonialism. Like many others, the Orons were facing hardship and disruption, but the Tana Bagats, led by Jatra Bagat, they focused on religious and cultural reform as a form of resistance.
So they strengthened their own communities.
Yeah.
Instead of fighting the British directly.
Exactly. Jatra Bagat preached nonviolence, self-discipline, spiritual purity. He wanted his followers to give up things like alcohol, tobacco, meat, to live a simple life. He also emphasized education and self-reliance. He wanted the Orons to break free from poverty and dependence.
It sounds like a movement of self-empowerment. Reclaiming their identity and taking control.
You could say that. And it's important to note that the Tana Bagats were inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, who is becoming a prominent leader of the Indian nationalist movement.
Connecting their struggle with the fight for India's freedom?
Precisely. They saw British colonialism as exploiting them and corrupting their culture. They believed that by purifying themselves and going back to their traditions, they could resist British influence and help achieve Swaraj.
Swaraj resonating with tribal communities.
It did. For the Tana Bhagats, Swaraj meant freedom from British rule and freedom from the oppression of landlords, moneylenders, anyone they saw as exploiting them. They believed that true liberation needed political and social change.
A holistic approach.
Exactly. And they acted on their beliefs. They refused to pay rent to bad landlords. They protested against British policies, and they promoted education and social reform within their communities.
Resisting within their own beliefs and values.
They did. The Tana Bhagat movement shows that resistance could be many things: armed rebellion, peaceful protest, cultural and spiritual revival. It's important to see this diversity of tactics.
It adds to our understanding of their struggles.
Absolutely. Let's go down south to Andhra Pradesh, to the Godavari Agency area, where the legendary Rampa Rebellion happened, also known as the Manyam Rebellion, from 1922 to 1924.
The Rampa Rebellion, associated with the incredible Alluri Sitarama Raju.
You're right. Alluri Sitarama Raju, even though he wasn't tribal himself, became a champion for tribal rights, a symbol of resistance against British exploitation.
He's considered a folk hero, right?
Absolutely. He was a fascinating guy, deeply influenced by Gandhi's nonviolence. But he also knew that sometimes armed resistance was necessary to defend the rights of those being oppressed. He saw the hardship faced by tribal communities in the Godavari Agency area: forced labor, restrictions on their practices, exploitation by officials.
So he understood their struggles, even though he wasn't one of them.
He did. He immersed himself in their world, learned their language, understood their customs, listened to their problems. He realized the British policies, especially the Madras Forest Act of 1882, were the root cause of their suffering.
Madras Forest Act of 1882. What was wrong with it?
This act made tons of forest land government property, restricting tribal access to resources they needed to survive. Suddenly, they couldn't collect forest produce, practice their agriculture, hunt, all the things they had done for centuries.
It sounds bad.
It was. And Alluri Sitarama Raju understood this wasn't just about economics, it was an attack on their whole way of life, their culture, identity, their connection to their land.
So he decided to fight back.
He did. He started going around the forests, organizing the Adivasis, teaching them about their rights, preparing them to resist these policies.
A true champion for the underdog.
He was. He inspired the tribal communities with his courage, passion, and commitment to their cause.
So how did the Rampa Rebellion play out? What was his plan?
Alluri Sitarama Raju knew they couldn't win a traditional war, so he used guerrilla tactics, using the dense forests to their advantage.
Smart. The forests had always provided for them. Now they would protect them.
Exactly. He trained the Adivasis in guerrilla warfare, taught them how to use their knowledge of the land. He also emphasized discipline, unity, strategic planning.
Turning